Again. I guess we can get started. Well, I have to admit that I'm a little remiss. Is there a candidate for new membership or a guest here today that was supposed to be?
You're a new member.
Well, I was a member a year ago, but I've never been to an in-person lunch before.
And your name is your name Andy?
No, it's Jamie.
Jamie?
Yeah.
You've been a guest here before.
On Zoom.
Okay,
I've been a guest and a member on Zoom, but never been here in person.
Oh, you've already been accepted into, well, welcome. And I have a pen for you, Jamie. So see me after. I have a pen. Congratulations.
Jamie is the chair of the London Energy. He's done a great job.
Okay. By the way, speaking of people holding titles and stuff in London, I'd like to mention a couple of our members who just won an election there. One being Bill Helm is another 3-year term as select board. And you both that's sitting back there who's on the budget committee. 3-year term. Congratulations to you guys. Jerry what? Jerry, what I'm done. What about?
Library trustee.
Oh, library trustee. I'm sorry, Jerry. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I miss everybody else. I had asked Paul that guy to speak to us. Unfortunately, he was unable to make it today. And I'm sure I won't fill his shoes, but I want to thank you all for going along with our protocols. I don't know how much longer they're going to be necessary to enforce, but I think that the being boosted is important. And I did have some pushback in that area, but we held firm, and I think it's going to work out. And I'd like to thank you all for participating and going along with that. I think it's important. The number one concern is for the health of everybody that's here. And so anyway, enough said on that. We also talked about masks. That's an independent thing now. We just recently here in Forbes Tavern dropped the requirement, I guess it was this week, that you had to wear a mask except while eating or drinking. So do whatever makes you feel comfortable. Again, we are shifting, obviously, you all know better than myself, from a pandemic to an endemic thing, and we can see what's happening, and hopefully we'll continue in this direction that we've been heading. So we've had our dues every year. It's kind of a struggle. There's always about 20 folks that we have to keep going back for. Some of them legitimate, but a lot of people just plain forget or overlook it. Our membership is actually down from a couple years ago. We were holding steady at about 126. As of this week, we're down to about 116, even with all the additions we've had, which again, I want to thank you all for participating in that. I think we've had a great number of new people that have joined the organization. So again, thank you, and keep up the good work. And remember, guests are free, so at least one time. So continue the good work there. I guess without any further ado, I'd like to get into our presenter today. And it's my pleasure, actually, to introduce a good friend of mine, Ann Beattie. So Ann Beattie is an educator, historian, mostly on the East Coast, although in her previous life, she was taught marketing at both Columbia and the Wharton School of Business in UPenn. Upon retirement, her passion, or certainly fascination, has become the Isles of Shoals. She's a past president of the Isles of Shoals Historical Association. She's on the board of the Portsmouth Athenaeum, and I'm missing something else in there. I know she's involved with a lot of stuff on the coast, and she continues to give presentations. Today, her topic is the Isle of Shoals and the remarkable history, the beauty and enchantment of it, the fishing industry going back to the early 1700s, 1603 timeframe, how the shoals set the world market for cod. And that's where all the activity was in the New World back in the day. And you'll also learn why anybody that was anybody in the arts basically filled their or came out with their steam chest and stayed at one of the grand hotels. And hopefully she'll have some slides, and it's just amazing. And the menus that they had back in those days. Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to have you welcome Ann Beattie. You, by the way, you're welcome to be with us today.
Thanks so much, Joe. And thank you all for having me. It's lovely to see such an illustrious audience. My family thanks you. They're pleased to have someone besides them listen to me today. So I'm going to talk to you about the history of the Isles of Shoals, the rich tapestry of history. These austere and strikingly beautiful islands. And we'll explore about 4 centuries of communities out on the Isles, European settlement. Now, interestingly, now is the period of time in history where the shoals are probably the least known that they ever have been. They were world famous for their dried cod, and in later centuries, world famous for their resort hotels. And we'll explore those through a series of fascinating images. This is a satellite view of the coastline of New Hampshire. The Isles of Shoals are fairly close to land, only about 10 miles from Portsmouth and 7 miles from their closest point on the mainland in Rye, New Hampshire. But they are surrounded by the sea and isolated. When you're there, you feel like it's a different world. Even today, if you're planning on going out and returning the same day, the weather's going to decide, not your boat captain. Now, about 400 years ago, Captain John Smith of Pocahontas fame was sent over to the New World by some speculators over in England. And he was sent to look for riches, timber, furs, gold. What he found, though, was more lucrative than all of those things in the beginning, and that was codfish. He came over, and he himself didn't particularly like to fish, but he and other explorers were sending tales back to England about the Gulf of Maine, the New World off of our coastline, saying, you know, you can dip your pail in the water and pull it up full of cod. I wouldn't be surprised if they had said, you can skip from ship to ship on the back of the codfish in the Gulf of Maine, where the shoals are located. And Smith himself didn't particularly care for fishing, so he got in a small boat with 6 of his men, and he went up and down the coastline of New England and drew this remarkably accurate map in 1614. And he really, literally was the first to put the shoals on the map. He renamed them after himself, Smith Isles. Sadly for him, no one else ever referred to them that way, but he tried. So he goes back to England, and a couple years later, he publishes basically a promotional brochure for the New World. And in it, he describes the incredible cod fishing and the Isles of Shoals. And a lot of young men in England, particularly those without a lot of financial prospects, those who weren't firstborn sons and deigned to inherit their father's estates, they would hear about this fishing over in the New World, and many of them flocked here. Several of them, particularly from Cornwall and Devon, targeting the Isles of Shoals as a base. And fishing was something that you could get into without a huge capital outlay, unlike lumber, timber. or trapping furs. So these young men came over to the coast of what's now New England, known as New England, and they settled. By the 1620s, there were 6 fishing stations in what's now Maine and New Hampshire. A decade later, you would also see stations on Cape Ann and Cape Cod. Plymouth was the only real settlement. These fishing stations were camps, and they took place mostly in the summer. The Shoals, the Isles of Shoals, became the main point of export for cod that was dried in the New World. And dried cod fueled the burgeoning economy of the New World. It was something people could obtain. It was highly desired and prized over in Europe, and it didn't require a lot of money to do. So there were, by the mid 1600s, there were about 600 fishermen out at the Isles of Shoals. In the summer months, sometimes that was swelled to, it's thought to be perhaps 1,000 people fishing off of the shoals, using the islands as a base. They were hand lining cod, simply a rope and a hook, out of these small boats known as shallops. It was dangerous, it was hard and brutal on them, but they were catching upwards to 100 fish per man per day. And these were great cod that weighed between 100 and 150 pounds. So many of them were making their fortunes out at the Isles of Shoals. The cod was salted and dried before it was exported to Europe. So it was laid out on these wooden racks called flakes to dry in the sun after being salted. And this was pretty labor intensive, weeks or months at a time. You had to turn the codfish frequently. You couldn't let it get too much sun or it would spoil. If it rained, you had to either turn the cod skin side up, which would protect it from remoisturizing, or as many of the shoalers did, you could run in and get your bed quilt to cover the cod laying on the flakes and protect it from the rain. The cod dried at the Isles of Shoals set the world market price for cod. And this includes cod dried in Iceland, cod dried off of what's now Canada. It was prime, not only because of the quality of the fish in the Gulf of Maine, but because the shoalers had a secret recipe for drying the cod. They would pile it with marsh grass interspersed and allow the fish to sweat or begin to ferment. And then they would lay it out on the flakes, and they would repeat this process. Because the weather was perfect, the perfect amount of sun, the perfect amount of wind, they could use less salt to dry the cod. And they would do this for 3 months at a time, but it produced a prime piece of salt cod, kind of the foodies cod, if you will. It was famed across the world, highly sought in Catholic countries like Spain and Portugal. And in fact, not only was it during the 1600s that Isles of Shoals dried cod developed this amazing reputation, that carried on in centuries to come. So here is an article I found, a recipe from a newspaper in Indiana in the mid 1800s, a recipe for salt cod balls, noting the codfish to be the best, Isles of Shoals fish preferable. So even out in the Midwest, 200 years later, they were talking about Shoals done fish, which sold for 3 to 4 times the price of cod sold anywhere else in the world. Now, during that period of time, most of the fishermen lived on Hog Island, the largest of the Isles of Shoals, now known as Appledore. And their neighborly squabbles took place out at the Isles of Shoals, just like they would anytime you get an isolated community of people trying to get along together. This one particular event is recorded in York, Maine at the courthouse. It was illegal on the Isles of Shoals to keep livestock because the livestock would pester the codfish laid out on the flakes to dry, and foul the waters and so on. It was also illegal to have women on the Isles of Shoals. Evidently, we were just too distracting. And I worried about prostitution back in England. So one man took his neighbor to court on Hog Island and accused him of keeping a goat, a pig, and a wife. And the judge heard the case and ruled that the livestock indeed was a nuisance and had to go. The wife could remain if there were no further complaint against her. And this changed things dramatically for the fishermen out at the Isles of Shoals. And life got a lot more comfortable because once you have a wife and have children, you start building a school, planting a garden. So life improved. By 1700, the population out at the Isles of Shoals was half of what it had been as a heyday, in its heyday. In only 50 years, the population went from about 600 to 300 people. Everybody who made their fortune, people like Sir William Pepperell, who settled in Kittery, Maine, and built up a fishing empire, they left the shoals and moved to the mainland where life was a lot more comfortable and there was more opportunity. In the late 1600s, Massachusetts Bay Colony controlled Hog Island, where most of the fishermen lived at the Isles of Shoals, and they decided to tax the Shoalers. And being very independent people, the Shoalers saw no reason to pay taxes to a mainland who did nothing for them. They also refused to send representatives to mainland government, thinking they were an entirely different country. So what they did when they were threatened with taxation was to simply move across the harbor to Star Island, which was in the province of Maine, live free or die. And on Star Island, they founded the village of Gosport, which is pictured here later on. The fishermen on the Isles of Shoals in the 1700s were poor. They were itinerant. They were either sustenance fishing for their family, or they were fishing under the employment of men from Boston, Ipswich, that now owned the Isles of Shoals. And then along came the Revolutionary War. And the province of New Hampshire decided to evacuate the Isles of Shoals, in part for the Shoalers' own safety, but also they weren't so sure that the independent Shoals fishermen might not just decide to line up with the Tories. So the people on the Isles of Shoals were now told they had to leave their homes, their gardens, their community, and go to the mainland. So what many of them did, Shoalers being rather clever people, was they took their timber and beam frame homes, put them on rafts or barges, and floated them to the mainland. So that there are reputed to be Isles of Shoals homes, buildings from the time of the Revolutionary War in places like Rye, New Hampshire, and York, Maine. This is one of those Shoals homes in York. It was torn down in the 1950s. By 1800, population of the Shoals was only 100 people, and they did not have the best reputation. They worked hard, they played hard. That was true of any of the fishing communities along the coast. Here's one encyclopedia describing the residents of Gosport Village on Star Island at the Shoals. The inhabitants are about 100. They live solely by fishing and in connection with those of the shore in their immediate neighborhood who follow the same mode of life are the most rude and uncivilized beings in New England except the Indians. Efforts have recently been made to improve their condition, and they now have a meeting house, school, etc. Well, this is the chapel that was built on Star Island in the village of Gosport in 1800. And it's the third chapel that sat on that spot on a hill. The second chapel was burned down by the Shoalers themselves. Some say in a night of drunken revelry. But a much more kind and logical thought is that the Shoalers burned their own chapel, which was wooden, the second one, simply because they were cold. The chapel was not only the place where they held services, it was their town meeting hall. It sometimes served as the school. In times of plenty, they used it to store dried salted cod. So it's unlikely they would have burned that particular building unless they really needed to. And these people were poor. They couldn't count on driftwood for heat in inclement months. They had dug up all the peat on the island, which was very little to begin with. So it's entirely possible that the Shoalers burned their chapel for warmth. A society on the mainland gathered money from seacoast towns and built this third and current chapel in 1800, wisely out of stone. And in the mid 1800s, the Shoalers themselves, despite the fact that they had very little money, built their own schoolhouse, and as a tribute to their own and their ancestors' fishing, they put this weather vane on top of the chapel. Codfish. At this point in time, one of my favorite squabbles between residents on the Isles of Shoals took place between Elvin Newton. This is the mid 1800s. Elvin Newton brokered fish distribution, cod, between the Isles of Shoals and Canada. And he took issue with the minister on the Shoals at the time, Reverend George Beattie. For some reason, he didn't care for him. And he wrote 17 letters to the society, the missionary society that had sent George Beattie to the Isles of Shoals, accusing Reverend Beattie of not holding Sunday services and stealing a melodeon, a medicine chest, and tools from the chapel. So the society, on receiving these 17 letters from Elvin Newton, sent a representative out to the Isles of Shoals who confronted Reverend Beattie with the accusations. Reverend Beattie immediately produced the notes for his sermons from the last several Sundays and said, it simply isn't true. So the society went back to the mainland, and you would think that would be the end of the issue, especially given that Reverend Beattie was a man of the cloth. However, he was a Shoaler at heart. And at his next Sunday sermon, he preached that the devil had built a telegraph between hell and earth, and its operator was one Elvin Newton. By the early 1800s, mid 1800s, the fishing era at the Isles of Shoals declined. You'll note the state of the flakes or wooden racks that were used to hold the dried salted fish are fairly dilapidated in this image. What happened is that people at the Isles of Shoals were sending out day boats, sending out their own small boats for daytime inland fishing. And it was so lucrative in the mid 1600s that just as anything that raises money does, it attracted investors. And there were huge conglomerates from Gloucester and Boston that were sending these large boats out to the Grand Banks for a couple of weeks and coming back with their holds full of fish. And the little mom and pop operations on the Isles of Shoals simply couldn't compete. You also had the Transcontinental Railroad go in the early 1870s. So now your housewife in Chicago didn't have to use salted dried cod for their Friday supper. She could get fresh fish that came in on the railroad. And some scientists believe that even by 1800, the cod stock in the Gulf of Maine had been depleted. But the shoals became revitalized. They simply refused to be left alone. And as the fishing era waned, the resort era began. In the 1840s, there was an upper middle class fellow from Portsmouth named Thomas Layton, who came out to the Isles of Shoals and took a position as the lighthouse keeper at the lighthouse on White Island. He fell in love with the shoals, purchased several of the islands, and decided to build a hotel on Hog Island. Being a wise marketer, he renamed the island Appledore after Appledore, England, and he built the Appledore House. This is the initial building. He eventually expanded it to be 3 wings, had 170 rooms, slept 400 people. There was a small natural cove out in front of the hotel that became known as the sun-kissed bathing pool. They blocked the narrow end off from the seawater. And you'll see here pictured, there were changing rooms for men and women on opposite sides of the pool for propriety's sake. This is one of my all-time favorite Shoals images because you see these ladies here making a beeline for the men's changing room. On a hot summer day, you could plop your derriere into a half whiskey barrel and participate in the barrel races across the pool. In your heavy woolen swim costume, there were tennis courts. There was entertainment for the gentlemen as well. And the success of Appledore House out at the Isles of Shoals spurred some competition across the harbor on Star Island. So the initial middle wing of Appledore House was built in 1848. 8 years later, a prominent family on Star Island in the village of Gosport started running a boarding house called the Atlantic House. So Thomas Layton over on Appledore adds the north wing to his hotel. The family on Star Island opens a second boarding house called Gosport. Thomas Layton adds the third wing to his now huge resort hotel. And then along came the big guns. A wealthy merchant from Boston built the Grand Oceanic Hotel on Star Island to rival Appledore House across the harbor. The merchant's name was John Poor, and he was a partner in the Stickney and Poor Mustard and Spice Emporium. And he did rather a clever thing. He went to stay at Appledore House on Appledore Island in the summer of 1872. You see that he and his partner Stickney signed the hotel register for that year. And while he was there, he talked to the friendly Layton family about how much it costs to bring goods in from the mainland, what their rate structure was. And he decided to purchase Star Island. So he and an agent he hired went to each family on Star Island, each fishing family, asking if they would sell their land. Many of them did, perhaps not even knowing that their neighbors were doing so as well. So that by the next summer, John Poor owned almost all of Star Island. Only 2 families didn't sell to him. And he built the Grand Oceanic Hotel, with the Boston Globe reporting, "This new and elegant hotel is now open for the reception of guests. The location, scenery, climate, and facilities for boating, bathing, and fishing are unsurpassed. A first-class physician is connected with the house." The Oceanic the style of architecture was very typical for Victorian seaside hotels at the time, very long and narrow so that all rooms had a view of the sea. It was almost 300 feet long by 40 feet wide. There were 147 rooms and the hotel could sleep 300 people. The hotel was 4 stories and had what's thought to be the first elevator of any hotel in the United States. Out back, there was a grocery, a couple of bowling alleys, billiard room with 4 tables, a bar. There was a dancing hall for what they called hops, and an orchestra would be hired for the entire summer season. If you were staying at the Oceanic, you had your choice of baths, warm or cool, fresh or salt water. Mail was delivered to guests of the Oceanic from the mainland 3 times a day. Now here you see just the corner of the Oceanic Hotel that John Poor built. And the rest of the buildings are cottages where the fishing family lived, or the boarding houses. I mentioned that all but 2 families sold their land on Star Island to John Poor. Most of them desperately regretted having left the Isles of Shoals and selling out. So being clever Shoalers, they did get their own back at John Poor in a small way. Here's a blurb from the New York Times, referring to Poor's Hotel. It is named the Oceanic, but the fishermen of Gosport, taking umbrage at the efforts of Mr. Poor, the proprietor, to get them off the island, have called it the Poor House. John Poor held 2 seasons worth of sailing regattas, invitations to 500 yacht clubs around the United States, balls, races. Now, the rivalry between the Oceanic Hotel on Star Island and Appledore House across the harbor at Appledore wasn't as intense as some people might think, because the hotels basically catered to different crowds. So from newspaper reports of the time, the Oceanic on Star Island is the modern establishment and is patronized chiefly by the lovers of modern things. The Appledore House takes the other crowd. This summer, it is said, the Oceanic House on Star Island was the gayest, the Appledore the most elegant and comfortable. And in a letter written by the famous Quaker abolitionist poet John Greenleaf Whittier to the socialite and author Annie Fields, Whittier notes about his stay on Appledore at the Appledore House. We had a charming time at the island. There were 300 or 400 people there, mostly nice folks, solid and respectable. The fast boys and girls go to Star Island. So the 2 hotels catered to different crowds, but nonetheless, it was an extremely social thing to do. It was a social event. Both the New York Times and the Washington Post would report the names of the people sojourning and staying at the show's hotels. Sadly, after 3 summer seasons, the Oceanic caught fire and burned to the ground. No one was hurt except a night watchman who had jumped out a window. It was said the glow of flames could be seen from Boston. But Poor was not going to be undone. He put together a second Oceanic hotel on Star Island. And I say put together because he put it together like the pieces of a puzzle. Some of the building may look familiar because this was the previous Atlantic boarding houses, the westernmost wing, and the easternmost was the previous Gosport boarding house. And then Poor took some lumber that he had intended to use to build a kitchen extension of the original Oceanic and joined the 2 boarding houses together. And there you have it, the rather unusually designed second Oceanic hotel. There were 78 rooms. It slept 177 people. You'll notice on either side of the front stairs, there's a small discreet opening. That's where the gentleman could go downstairs to bowl, play pool, or get a haircut. All of the rooms were gas lit and eventually had electric lightings and electric bells to summon the staff. There were hot saltwater baths And the promotional brochures for the Second Oceanic advertised public and private bathrooms with open plumbing and perfect drainage. There was a spacious reading room and parlor. Fires were lit in the fireplaces. You would go into the lobby to register, and the lobby looks much the same today. You could relax, read, converse in the lobby, which was quite spacious. Maybe get a bite to eat in the dining room. Outside, perhaps, practice your drive. Now, Poor eventually had it. He and his wife and young son were living on Star Island, and he decided that the hotel business was not for him. So he sold it to the Leighton family, the Oceanic and Star Island. So now the Leighton family owned both Appledore House and the Oceanic, and they started promoting the hotels together. Here's a broadside that promotes the Shoals basically as a health spa, an ideal summer resort of the highest class. This is a great resort for anyone suffering from insomnia, hay fever, or rose cold, which just means allergies. This is an article that appeared in the precursor of the New England Journal of Medicine, talking about the Isles of Shoals as a summer resort for the invalid. So people went to the Shoals for their health. They went for entertainment. They went to fish recreationally. This particular article notes in one day, hotel guests at the Isles of Shoals caught 2,000 pounds of fish. And there's the infamous 356-pound halibut caught by a guest of the Oceanic Hotel on Star Island. People came for their health. They came to fish and vacation with their steam trunks. They also came to meet Thomas Leighton's daughter, the man who was the lighthouse keeper, built the Appledore House Hotel, and whose family now owned both hotels at the Shoals. Her married name was Celia Thaxter, and she was a famous poet and essayist, published in the Atlantic Monthly, Harper's, published many books. If People magazine had existed back then, she'd have been on the cover several times. If we had gone to school back then, we would have memorized her poetry in grade school. As Celia had a cottage very close to her family's hotel on Appledore. And guests would approach the cottage, go out to the Shoals, approach the cottage, hoping to meet her. In Celia's parlor, she entertained many of the famous writers, musicians, and artists of the day. So she would hold these gatherings for her American Impressionist artist friends, people like J. Appleton Turner out of Newburyport, or J. Appleton Brown, or Ross Sterling Turner out of Salem, or probably the most famous now, Child Hassam, a dear, dear friend of Celia's. It was Celia Thaxter, in fact, who suggested that Hassam use his middle name because she thought it was much more memorable than Fred. He was a really good friend and, in fact, illustrated her last published book. So you had the artists coming to visit Celia and to paint scenes of the Shoals. You had writers like her mentor, John Greenleaf Whittier, and Sarah Orrin Jewett, who wrote about the life and people of Maine. So the writers would come in having written a poem out on the shore that day. The artists would get inspired and do a painting based on the poem. The musicians would play. People, for example, like Julius Eichberg, who founded the Boston Conservatory of Music. His song Foreboding, he said, was the best thing he had ever written. He wrote the music, his friend Celia Thaxter wrote the words. So Celia held what was one of the first salons in America, and everyone who attended was enriched by the talents of the others. Eventually, around 1900, at that turn of that century, the resort business at the Isles of Shoals declined. A lot of new hotels went up along the seacoast on the mainland. Appledore House was the first large resort hotel built north of Boston, but now there was competition on the mainland, and these hotels were newer. They had more of the modern conveniences. The hotels out of the Shoals were 25, 50 years old. And the railway went in between Portsmouth and the White Mountains. So the White Mountains became the chic vacation destination, places like the Mount Washington Hotel. And eventually, in the early 1900s, Appledore House burned to the ground. Same fate as the original Oceanic, and same thing that's happened to most of the wonderful, grand Victorian resort hotels along the seacoast in New England. The fire at Appledore House was so intense, it was said that the paint on the Oceanic on Star Island across the harbor blistered during that fire. Again, no one was hurt. But the Shoals continued their lure, and folks with a new purpose emerged at the turn of that century to congregate and form communities on the Isles of Shoals. Just before the turn of the century, the Unitarian used to hold summer meetings at Lake Winnipesaukee, and they decided to try and hold them out at the Isles of Shoals because it would be cooler. So they approached the proprietors of the Oceanic Hotel, the managers, and they said, look, we know you charge $21 a week for room and board. This is in 1897. We would like to come and stay, but we really can only afford $10 a week. But we promise we'll fill the hotel. Can we come? The Oceanic agreed. And not only did the Unitarians fill the Oceanic Hotel, they spilled over and filled Appledore House out of the Isles of Shoals as well. 600 people came to that first summer meeting. And those meetings, those conferences, those programs have continued throughout the years. In the early 1900s, Star Island was purchased by what was then the Congregationalists and the Unitarians. The nonprofit Star Island Corporation was formed. And just over a decade later, they purchased Appledore Island as well. So those programs have been operating for well over 100 years. Programs having to do with spiritual renewal, also with topics such as science, arts, history, even yoga. And they've continued throughout the years, welcoming everyone. So today, Star Island is part of the remarkable 9 Isles of Shoals. The candlelit processions to the chapel that began over a century ago in the evenings still occur today. The Oceanic Hotel continues to welcome guests. And it's interesting, before 1950, there were over 150 grand resort hotels built along the coastline of New England. Today, fewer than 10 remain. And only one has not been completely renovated. And that's the Oceanic Hotel on Star Island. On Appledore, the Shoals Marine Lab operates, run jointly by the University of New Hampshire and Cornell. Rather unique, most labs are set up for graduate student and faculty research. The Shoals Marine Lab is for the undergraduate study of marine science. Smutty Nose Island is owned privately by two different people, one of whom is a descendant of Celia Thaxter. For the past several years, it's been the site of an archaeology dig by professors Nate Hamilton of the University of Southern Maine and Robin Hadlock Seeley of UNH and their students. They have found some remarkable things. One, historians long believed that the Isles of Shoals were probably not populated by indigenous people. Why would you go to an island with very little vegetation, no mammals to speak of, so you couldn't hunt? You might go out for daytime fishing, but you wouldn't settle there. But the archaeological evidence found by these folks indicates otherwise. They found stone flakes, which are byproducts of manufacturing stone tools. And you probably didn't pick up and go out somewhere for a Saturday afternoon and manufacture tools. So it's likely indigenous people did settle on the Isles of Shoals at some point. They were able to date the artifacts they found to 6,000 years ago. Students also found cod vertebrae. And given the other artifacts located in the same strata of the earth as those vertebrae, and being able to extrapolate the size of the cod from the vertebrae, as well as using carbon dating, they found that indeed, shoalers were regularly catching cod that weighed on average 120 pounds. Duck Island, the northernmost of the Isles of Shoals, is a nesting site for double-crested cormorants, the largest of the marine birds out at the shoals. It's also a hauling out or resting site for seals, both harbor seals and gray seals. And the students at Shoals Marine Lab did a count of seals, a daily count several years ago. In one 24-hour period, they counted over 500 seals by Duck Island. White Island, one of the two southernmost of the Isles of Shoals, is the site of the lighthouse where Celia Thaxter's father took a job in the mid-1800s. This is the second lighthouse to stand on White Island, and it was falling apart, crumbling. There were holes in it so big that you could stick your hand through to the interior from the outside. And a group of grade school kids along the seacoast formed an organization. They call themselves the White Island Lighthouse Kids. And they decided to raise money to continually repair the lighthouse. The kids were able to attract a matching federal grant for $250,000. And these are children on their own. And they continue to repair the lighthouse at White Island. Seavey Island, another of the southernmost Isles of Shoals, is the site of a tern restoration project. Terns are the smallest of the marine birds at the shoals. And in 1997, New Hampshire Audubon and the Shoals Marine Lab and a bunch of worthwhile organizations got together and decided to try and lure terns back into nesting at the Isles of Shoals. There were 6 pairs of nesting common terns that first year of the project. On average, and last summer, over 2,500 pairs of nesting common terns, almost 50 pairs of roseate terns, and even some rare Arctic terns. So the Isles of Shoals of today are a remarkable, magical place. You have the conferences or programs operating on Star Island all summer long on a range of different topics. You've got students studying out at Appledore at the Shoals Marine Lab. You have what amount to nature preserves on Duck Island with the double-crusted cormorants and the seals, and on Seavey Island with the Tern Restoration Project. And both Smutty Nose and Duck Islands are protected by conservation easements. So 350 years ago, hundreds of people flocked to the Isles of Shoals. They came to fish. 150 years ago, hundreds of people came to the Shoals again to stay at one of the wonderful resort hotels. And today, hundreds of people go to the Shoals to learn and for spiritual renewal. So, there are lots of stories about mysteries and mayhem and ghosts and pirates, legends of the Isles of Shoals. But let me tell you the most frightening story of all. It concerns Lunging Island, the westernmost of the Isles of Shoals. In 1973, Aristotle Onassis got a purchase option for Lunging Island. He was going to build an oil refinery in Durham, New Hampshire, run a pipeline through out the seacoast, and offload oil tankers at Lunging Island at the Isles of Shoals. Had it not been for the care of the citizens of New Hampshire, we all know what an oil spill looks like, and we know what it can do to our wildlife. So had people not organized and been active and repelled this project, visiting the Isles of Shoals today could look like this instead of this.